Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to our REDS seminar, which is also our CDDRL, Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law seminar. I will let you know that REDS is a sub-program called, which is Rethinking European Development and Security. And so we've had a number of folks who work on European development and security, and it spells REDS for a reason, subtle. No. And why we need to rethink European development and security. Who knows? We don't know. But it may be a certain country that is often depicted in red. Our last speaker, I think we had, let's see, who was it? Stephen Fish, maybe, was our last speaker. And so we are particularly happy to welcome another top flight leading scholar on the general issue of European development and security, and that is our friend Oxana Shevel, who is an associate professor of political science at Tufts University and currently the vice president of the Association for the Study of Nationalities. I didn't know that. And the American Association of Ukrainian Studies, that I knew. Her work explores nation building and identity politics in the post-Soviet region. Her book on migration and refugee policy and state building in post-communist Europe from Cambridge University Press won the American Association for Ukrainian Studies Best Book Prize. Her recent work has focused on the sources of citizenship policies in the post-communist states, comparative memory politics and religious politics in Ukraine. She has a PhD from Harvard, and I'm not going to say the years because I recently gave a slew of talks over the last 2 weeks at so-called distinguished lecture series, and I really feel that I'm too fun, hip, and cool to be distinguished. And to my horror, they announced when I got my PhD, and I was like, what? So I'm not doing that to anyone else. I know that experience, but it was not that long ago in Oksana's case. She has also had more recent work with Maria Popova, who's at McGill University in Canada. Currently, they are writing a book on the root causes of the Russo-Ukrainian War, which I gather is due in 3 days. So we'll soon be hot off the presses. And this might be the title, Russia and Ukraine, still, yep. Entangled History, Diverging States, and it should be released in late this year. So Oksana is going to, I'm going to get out of the way. Oksana is going to speak, and then we'll have questions. So if you need to put your hand up, just do it for a point of clarification. And Oksana, welcome to Stanford. And sorry that it's not as warm as it is on the East Coast today.
Thank you very much, Kathryn, for inviting me for this generous introduction. Thank you all for coming. So I'm going to talk today, so I titled the talk, Identity and Religion at Times of War in Ukraine. And I'm going to try to do two things. So I will first talk briefly about how Ukrainian identity consolidated, starting already after Euromaidan uprising in 2014, and especially, again, sort of turbocharging consolidation, I think one might say, following Russia's full-scale invasion in February of last year. And then I'll talk about implications of this new kind of identity reality and also new electoral reality, which is produced for specifically competition among Orthodox churches and church-state relations in that sphere. And if you're following the news, almost every day now there are reports about various sort of contentious things happening with Orthodox churches in Ukraine. So I'm hoping to shed a little bit light on what's behind it. So let me start again very briefly. Probably most in this audience are familiar with this argument that Ukraine has been long characterized as a divided country between the East and the West. The electoral map, for example, this map in blue and purple here in the bottom, this is the election results from 2010 between Yanukovych and Tymoshenko, kind of pro-Western, pro-Russian candidate, and it mapped on very closely, especially on the linguistic divide in Ukraine. So the predominance of Russian, not just ethnic Russians, they've been a minority everywhere except Crimea, but Russian speakers, so Ukrainians who identified as ethnic Ukrainians, but primarily spoke Russian in daily life, and sort of this argument that there is this sort of divide between sometimes it has been characterized as two Ukraines. And of course, in Russia, this whole narrative about how southeastern Ukraine is not really, is really through Russia. I mean, they claim the whole country, but especially this argument that this is Novorossiya, so-called New Russia, kind of fits in with this perception of Ukraine. Now, this perception was not completely inaccurate. There is, a lot of, it's in many ways has been a useful shortcut for explaining many things in Ukrainian politics, including the electoral outcomes we saw on the previous map. But scholars who study Ukraine, regionalism in Ukraine have been for a long time emphasizing how the picture is quite much more complex. Just very briefly scratching the surface, this is just to illustrate that this argument about even linguistic variation. So if you further segregate, the oblasts, the big regions into at the municipal level, you actually see that even in the south and eastern Ukraine and a lot of parts, Ukrainian still remains the language of the population. In the rural areas, the cities is a different story. And then, of course, sort of where exactly the border is was always contested. The center has been quite different from the two extremes in the east and the south. So this picture, again, just to briefly summarize it, that it was not entirely inaccurate, but it was always quite simplistic. And I would say that after the Euromaidan uprising and then ultimately the invasion of February 2002, that this divide no longer is relevant at all. So essentially there has been massive consolidation of Ukrainian identity, kind of pro-Ukrainian, pro-Western sentiment, including in the parts of the country that historically has been more pro-Russian, sort of in the south and the east. So just to show you how that has progressed, like for example, one important implication has been electoral politics. So even before Euromaidan, essentially with every round of elections, this purported east-west border has been moving somewhat to the east, right? So if we look at, for example, the vote in the first presidential elections in December 1991, the pro-Western candidate Chernovil wins only in Galicia, the part that was of the westernmost part of Ukraine, that was part of internal Poland. Then by 98, sort of that border moves a little bit more further east. And then that movement continues. And then if we look at the last two election results, this is the results, the middle slide and the one on the far right for you, 2012, 2014, 2019. So the pro-Western parties now win essentially pretty much everywhere except for the most far eastern parts. Now, if you add to it the fact that since 2014, after Crimea is annexed and the separatist insurgency starts in Donbass, where population, which is historically has been most pro-Russian, no longer votes in Ukrainian elections because Ukrainian elections cannot be held in Crimea and Eastern Donbass, essentially created this really unprecedented up until then reality that the pro-Western parties that advocated geopolitical orientation to the West and also kind of Ukrainian cultural agenda are able to win outright majority in the legislature. So that's something that is new and it's very important. And again, kind of ironically, I think it's a direct result of Putin's aggression against Ukraine. So in a way, one could say, I think that's a valid argument to make, that had he done nothing in 2014, Russia would have retained a lot of influence over Ukraine because these people in the East who did not support Euromaidan, who would have continued to vote for pro-Russian parties, and sort of this kind of in-between status and a lot of leverage that Russia had would continue, but that's not what happened. So then, in addition to this change in electoral geography, there has been substantial changes in identities and attitudes on all sorts of host of issues. I'm just going to show a few just to illustrate. For example, this is the consolidation of society at the time of war. So the Ukrainians, as you know, everybody knows from the news how the whole country kind of rose together and so forth. But that's, really the belief in this strengthening civic identity. There is a great recent book by Ola Onuch and Henry Hale called The Zelensky Effect that explains kind of how the civic Ukrainian identity consolidation has been happening. The Putin's inability to break the will of the society, even with this massive bombing of civilian infrastructure that he has engaged in. So the majority supports continuing resistance as opposed to some sort of negotiated settlement that would give Putin part of the territory. And then on all these geopolitical and identity issues, there has been also a sea change. So this great support for the EU and especially NATO. This is really quite unprecedented because NATO never had majority support in Ukrainian society, not even like approaching 30%, up until really after 2014, you can see how support begins to rise. And importantly, the support now is also majority view in the southern and eastern regions that are not occupied because there is no independent polling done, but in the government-controlled areas, that has been now also the majority view. The support for the Russia-led Eurasian Union, which up until Euromaidan was sort of evenly, maybe even slightly higher support than for the EU. is now a single digit and may even go down further. Not to say that completely disappeared regional divide. We can still see the South, for example, on the EU and the NATO, and the East rather, supporting in somewhat lesser percentage, but it's still, we are talking about 88, over 80% support, which is really quite unprecedented. That also translates into, these changes in attitudes. If we look at different, say, more like cultural aspects, support for giving Russian the status of official language in Ukraine has been declining for some time now. There is essentially no support for this. Not only that, more and more people now claim, at least in the polling, that not only they identify with Ukrainian as their native language, even if they sometimes do not speak it as their primary language of convenience. So that's interesting sort of phenomena that we can, I can go into Q&A if you're interested. But more and more people have been claiming Ukrainian as their native language. And since the invasion, according to the research by Volodymyr Kulik, who's like the preeminent expert on language aspects in Ukraine, he finds out that actually now more people report actually switching to speaking it. There are quite, moving stories from occupied Kherson, for example. I saw a video of a local resident who says, we learned Ukrainian under occupation. That was a sign kind of asserting your identity, opposing Russian invasion. These are people who have been speaking Russian, for generations. But they now also, some of them are increasingly switching to Ukrainian. So again, I think this is really a big irony, not to belabor the point, that it is really Putin's aggression and his desire to avoid losing Ukraine that really lost him Ukraine for good, right? So this kind of change, and that's, I think, captured in the quote from President Zelensky when this bombing of infrastructure started, and he repeated, right, so read my lips, like without you, right? But Putin has been in denial in his public statements. He basically either believes that these polls are somehow rigged, or that people are hiding their true pro-Russian preferences, and then only if Russian army comes in, then they would be welcome. That's of course not what's happening, but it seems like these sorts of changes has not really registered with the Russian president. But okay, so I want to move now to the implications for the churches, just again to highlight sort of the two main changes that have happened in Ukrainian society that I've just very briefly summarized, starting after Euromaidan and especially accelerating after the full-scale invasion, is this new electoral geography that put political forces favoring kind of Ukrainian cultural Ukrainianization, we can say, and Western orientation now have outright majority and are able to pass legislation in the parliament that before they could not, because they were, they had stronger opposition from various pro-Russian and Russia-friendly forces. And then this change in the societal attitudes that, again, many of these policies that before were not supported or were supported by minority are now supported by greater part of the population. Not necessarily, again, there is a lot of nuance there, sort of depending on specific policy, but this broader trend is there. And I want to focus the rest of my talk to talk about what does the changes mean for Ukrainian religious politics, and especially for the competition between Orthodox churches in Ukraine and this church-state relations. And in some sense, many crises that are unfolding as we speak that are reported widely in the media. So let me start with this very brief overview, what this Ukrainian intra-Orthodox competition looked like after 1991. So in the period from independence and until Euromaidan, there were essentially 3 Orthodox churches in Ukraine. This is kind of unusual because, in many countries that are Orthodox, Ukraine, about 70% of the population self-identifies as East and Right Orthodox. There is usually 1 church, but in Ukraine there are 3. There have been 3. One of them, the biggest one, is its official title is Ukrainian Orthodox Church, but it is usually referred to as the Moscow Patriarchy because it is affiliated with the Russian Orthodox Church. It has broad administrative autonomy since 1990, but it is part of Russian Orthodox Church and is recognized by the global orthodoxy as a part of so essentially communicates through the Russian Orthodox Church. So they've been the only so-called canonical church, so the one that global orthodoxy recognizes. Now, there were 2 additional churches, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Kiev Patriarchy and a smaller Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox Church. I'm not going to go into the history of this because there isn't enough time, but certainly we can talk about it more if there are questions. So these churches were independent, meaning that they were not subordinated in any way, canonically, ecclesiastically, administratively, to any other center like in Russia. But they were considered schismatics by the global orthodoxy. Essentially, they were not recognized ecclesiastically. And that was the situation up until 2014 and in the years after the situation would change. Now, two things I want to highlight about Orthodox kind of beliefs in Ukraine. It is often thought that this Moscow Patriarchy Church is more kind of East Ukrainian phenomena and the other churches would be more kind of West Ukrainian. That's only partly true because the religiosity in Ukrainian society is quite different levels of religiosity across regions. And in Eastern regions, there is generally fewer believers because of the communist legacy. So actually the strongholds, if we think of the number per capita of parishes per capita, the stronghold of the Moscow Patriarchy Church actually has been Central and Western Ukraine, with the exception of these three regions, which is Galicia, interwar Galicia, which was part of Poland before 1939. And this is where Greek Catholic Church, yet another church in Ukraine, it's essentially the stronghold there. But as you see, sort of other regions, Volyn, central Ukraine, this is where the Moscow Patriarchy had a lot of parishes because of higher levels of religiosity there per capita. Now, another very interesting phenomenon in Ukraine that when people are asked which church they identify with, there is a substantial part of the self-identified Orthodox who do not identify with any of the competing churches. They describe themselves as simply Orthodox. So in other words, when people were given a choice, right, what religious institution, right, you consider yourself belonging with as an Orthodox faithful, many people choose this option simply Orthodox. There has been a lot of research done about kind of this scholar Kathryn who's an anthropologist who's been studying religious attitudes and practices in Ukraine, named it, I think she calls it ambient faith, this sort of very peculiar practice of Orthodoxy in Ukraine when people kind of resist institutional subordination and sort of instructions, and really you can be Orthodox believer in many different ways, including by not identifying with any particular church. And you can see again, kind of region-wise, the simply Orthodox are also more prevalent in central and southern regions. But this top of this chart is also shows that over time, there has been growing support to some extent, and that especially becomes the case after Euromaidan for the independent church, right, the one not affiliated with Moscow, and decline in support for the Orthodox Church affiliated with Moscow. The important step in this evolution has been this ideology of the so-called Ruski Mir, or Russian world, which essentially denies Ukrainian nationhood. This is something since about 2009 has become kind of like a calling card and in some way foreign policy platform or agenda of the Russian state implemented, we can say through the Russian Orthodox Church, this narrative that there is this triunite Orthodox nation of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus that together constitute this holy Rus, right? And that's essentially is perceived by many in Ukraine as essentially denial of distinct Ukrainian nationhood, questioning the legitimacy of the Ukrainian state. And of course, it was also used after 2014 as a justification for Russian invasion. So this kind of background, I think important to take into account when we're talking about the more recent changes and conflicts that arose in the Ukrainian society. So when we now fast forward to Euromaidan, so this competition between these churches have been happening. Did I already put it here? Yes, so which one was largely right. So so the interesting phenomena here was that, as I was saying, that the Moscow Patriarchy Church had the largest number of parishes. And it remained institutionally dominant, but the extent of level of its support has been lower than the number of institutions that it has. So there was sort of like imbalance when you ask which church is the most important or the most widely supported. By the number of its institutional strengths, it would be the Moscow Patriarchy. But by the level of popular support, they have been, since 2014, in particular 2013, have been losing support in society. Why that was happening, I would say the main reason is that during the, starting already with Euromaidan protests themselves, and then subsequently once Russia starts aggression against Ukraine with annexation of Crimea and the Donbass, the Kiev Patriarchy and the Autocephalous Church very strongly came in support of Ukraine, first the Euromaidan protesters, and then Ukrainian state as it is fighting Russian aggression. So it was sort of very clear taking side, we can say, in this conflict. And the Moscow Patriarchy Church took more careful position. They basically were advocating for peace against war, but in these sort of more neutral terms, emphasizing that there is a brotherly, fratricidal war, right? Is that the term? The war between brothers, right? Their believers are on the two sides. of the front line. And that did not sit very well with a lot of members, of Ukrainian society, especially the ones who supported Euromaidan. Then if we add to it some maybe isolated but highly publicized in the media incidents, such as, for example, the hierarchs of the Moscow Patriarchy Church refusing to stand up in the parliament for a moment of silence for killed Ukrainian servicemen back in 2015, some priests refusing to perform last rites for Ukrainian soldiers killed in the front. They continue commemorating Kirill, who essentially sanctions Russian Patriarch, right, who sanctions this war. So these tensions have begun to grow, and many parishes wanted to transfer from the Moscow Patriarchy Church to this newly formed Ukrainian church. So let me talk a little bit. So if you think 3 churches was not enough, here let me complicate it a little bit more, right? So after Euromaidan, President Poroshenko and President Yushchenko attempted it before, after the Orange Revolution unsuccessfully, has lobbied ecumenical patriarch to essentially enable the creation of an canonically recognized, right, legitimate Orthodox Church in Ukraine that would be independent from Moscow. The goal was to create national church, as in for all these 3 competing churches to unite. And to form this new church that was formed and received the name Orthodox Church of Ukraine, so Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Ukraine, right? Not easy to keep track of them all. But what basically happened, only 2 of the churches, so the Kiev Patriarchy and the Autocephalous Church joined forces, and just 2 hierarchs from the Moscow Patriarchy Church joined the process and essentially split ranks and joined in forming this new OCU. So the OCU received in January 2019, Thomas, which is a decree of autocephaly from the ecumenical patriarch. So they became canonically recognized in that sense. And there are now, I think, about 4 other churches, Orthodox churches, that recognize them, and some still don't. And that has to do with the strong support, opposition rather, from Russia to this development. So President Poroshenko, once OCU is formed and it receives Thomas of autocephaly, he hails it as Ukraine's second independence. In Russia, they're absolutely furious. Putin called National Security Council, kind of considering it, again, a matter of national security, this breaking of the Russian world, essentially, right? The Patriarch of Moscow tried to lobby Bartholomew to not grant recognition to OCU. There has been a leaked transcript where the Russian Patriarch is telling Bartholomew how Ukrainian government is this illegal junta and this is not a real state, sort of all the typical cliches, right? But essentially, so there is this, this break, this formation of this new church, right? And again, we have this conflict over parishes because the OCU gains higher support, so they have majority support, broadly speaking, in the society, but Moscow Patriarchy still has more parishes, and then this conflict over parish transfer starts. So this period from the formation, essentially from Euromaidan, it starts even before OCU is formed, then there are attempts by many parishioners locally to have their parish switch affiliation from Moscow Patriarchy Church to this newly formed OCU. This process has been incredibly contentious, as you see, again, given the concentration per capita of the Moscow Patriarchy Church and kind of higher levels of religiosity. A lot of these conflicts were happening in central and western Ukraine, as opposed to really in eastern Ukraine. And most of these conflicts were happening really in villages where there was just one church. So there was really no option, right, for parishioners to just go to a different church, which say they had in the city. And the stumbling block, or what kind of was at the core of this dispute, of why made it so difficult, because it was not clear who actually belongs to a local religious community in Orthodox faith, and therefore who has the legal right to switch affiliation. And I want to spend just a few minutes on this because it is really quite complicated, but very important. So let me see if I can try to explain it kind of in simple terms. So Ukrainian legislation on religious affairs is very bottom-up. It is very democratic, we can say, conception of religious life. It is the local religious communities that are legal entities. They have the right to own property, do all of these things. And they, in theory, are supposed to have, again, according to the letter of the law, full autonomy as to like which center of religious influence they want to affiliate themselves with. So it's very different from kind of top-down idea that the church hierarchy would decide what their parishes can and can't do. So the letter of the law in Ukraine is this very bottom-up. Now, as you can imagine, the church hierarchy doesn't like it very much. So in case of the Moscow Patriarchy Church, starting already in the 1990s and really picking up after Euromaidan, they began to change their statutes and giving more and more power to the bishops to essentially cancel or be in a position to say if a decision of a particular parish is legal or illegal, right? So here we have this collision between, on the one hand, Ukrainian law that says, the parish has autonomy to do essentially whatever it wants, and the statute of the church that says unless the bishop okays the decision is not valid. And the law created this legal collision because it said that people who are local religious community can make these decisions by 2/3 majority, but the procedure has to follow the statute of religious community, and the statute basically said that they essentially cannot do that without the bishop's approval. So essentially what was happening in many of these cases, people who live in this village who would gather together and they say, okay, we want to switch. And the priest will say, no, 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 you are not a religious community. I get to decide who is religious community. And there usually has been maybe 5 or 10 founders. In Ukraine, any 10 people can found the church. And if these 10 people were opposed, they would say they are the true religious community and you are just territorial community. You are not a religious community. Do you see sort of the collision there? So it's a little bit convoluted, but that was essentially the essence of the dispute. And you can see this narratives going back and forth. People would say, I watched a lot of videos of these debates in the village, and some person would say, how can you say I'm not a parishioner? Like I got married in this church. I was baptized in this church. My parents were buried in this church. My grandmother, by the way, embroidered that ornament that you have in the church. But now you're telling me I'm not a parishioner. And there was kind of no really legal clear remedy to this. So most of these attempted parish transfers got stuck in court. So the community would try to transfer. The priest would oppose. Only about 20% of the priests of the Moscow Patriarchy agreed to switch with their parishes. Oftentimes parishioners would ask them to switch, but they would, refuse, again, for reasons I'm not going to go into now, but can talk about in the Q&A. So all of these, vast majority of these cases have been debated back and forth. And in the meantime, there has been sometimes physical confrontations over access to the parish, right? Between people who had legal documents saying, okay, we switched, and the local priest would say, no, I don't recognize this, we're appealing it in court, you cannot use the church. And some of these cases get publicized, it became very emotional because sometimes fallen soldiers, and that's something that has been in the news just lately, but that's only one example of several, that soldiers who died were not allowed, like their body could not be brought into the church because the priest refused. And each side would argue, that there has been just last week, this very publicized case in southwestern Ukraine, in Bukovina, that the mother was crying with the coffin of her son to get into the church building. The priest refuses to let the funeral procession in, and that parish has been disputed for 4 years. So the community there tried to switch. The Moscow Patriarchy appealed the switch, and essentially, the doors were broken into the church. The funeral took place, but you can imagine sort of the confrontation and the level of, emotional distress for all involved was very dramatic. So now, fast forwarding to the invasion. So this situation with the parishes remained unsolved. There was a law tabled in the Ukrainian parliament to mandate renaming of the church, of the Moscow Patriarchy Church, to indicate its affiliation with the Russian church, which the courts suspended. They didn't cancel it, but that law did not come into force. And the Russian church, the Moscow Patriarchy Church, basically disputed that it had anything to do with Russia. They claimed that they are separate, that they're Ukrainian, and all of this, allegations of them being somehow a part of the Russian church were not true. So that only got worse after the invasion. So there were cases, again, it's sort of really complexity of the situation cannot be overestimated. Many parishioners of the Moscow Patriarchy Church are serving in the Ukrainian armed forces. Many parishes collect donations and otherwise, aid the military. But at the same time, there also has been cases of the priests essentially openly collaborating with the Russian occupying forces. There has been some hierarchs of the Moscow Patriarchy Church who were present in Kremlin when Putin annexes these territories, and there have been insufficient reaction as far as a lot in the society concerned from the hierarchy of this church against these kinds of cases. So the collaborators were not condemned. These priests who went over to Russia were not expelled, or if they were suspended, they were suspended for like ill health and so forth, and not for collaboration. In May 2000 of last year, the Moscow Patriarchy Church held a council, Sobor in religious terms, and they changed their statute there, supposedly breaking all ties to the Russian Orthodox Church. That again has been questioned. So critics say that this break was sort of more like a pro forma, that they didn't really break it. They did not, for example, announce autocephaly. The head of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchy still is a member of the Supreme Council of the Russian Orthodox Church. They did not. So essentially the break was insufficient. So it was more kind of window dressing. It was more sort of fence sitting. Of course, the Moscow Patriarchy itself disputes that. There has been religious expertise done. So this debate is ongoing. But many, again, critics contend that this break was not really complete and quite artificial. And again, because they don't condemn their collaborators and so forth, it only further aggravates tensions. So Zelensky government, starting in the fall of last year, seems to have really changed its view and kind of decided. There has been the National Security and Defense Council resolution I think in October or maybe November. Then the security services of Ukraine essentially went in earnest investigating these allegations. So this is the latest statistics I was able to find. This is from early February. These numbers may be higher now, but about 350 localities have been raided by the security service of Ukraine. So monasteries, administrative centers, churches, and so forth. About 850 members of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchy hierarchy have been questioned. All sorts of Russian propaganda material has been found. Some 60 criminal cases have been opened. It's actually higher now because just in the last week, several more cases have been opened. The propaganda material, it becomes kind of interesting new dimension because Ukrainian criminal code has been changed last year. And this justification of the Russian aggression, spreading of the Russian narratives, denying the fact of Russian aggression against Ukraine, is now a criminal offense. So that's again sort of falls under the umbrella of protecting national security. Critics might say this is not democratic. UN Human Rights latest report cautiously sort of raises concern about it, but it's something that we can talk about. You know, the dilemma: how do you balance individual rights, the right to religious freedom of religion, and protection of national security in wartime, and especially these narratives that are used by Russia itself to justify the aggression. So there are also several pending laws in the Ukrainian parliament that would in various ways either limit or try to outright ban activities of Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchy with the terminology that it is a religious organization affiliated with influence centers located in country which carries aggression against Ukraine. So that's the terminology that the lawmakers have used. There are, I think, at least 3, maybe even more different drafts, but that's the wording from the one proposed by the government that Zelensky ordered the government to prepare in response to the National Security and Defense Council decision, basically saying that yes, activities of the UCMP hierarchy constitute potentially a national threat to national security. Just yesterday, the head of the parliament met with this organization, which kind of brings together all different religious denominations in Ukraine. What is it called? It's All Ukrainian Council on Religious Associations, something like the term is, the title is very long, but they essentially, at least the way the media reported it, they kind of support this law. So they said, yes, like we agree, we shouldn't have religious associations in Ukraine that have the center of influence in the aggressor state, meaning in Russia. And again, there is a dispute here because Moscow Patriarchy denies that they are in any ways affiliated with Russia, with the Russian church, but that's not what the government expertise finds. That's not what many critics contend. And almost every day there are some revelations. Just last week, there were revelations that the head of the church, Metropolitan Onufriy, actually has Russian citizenship. So again, he denied it. He said he had it, but then he gave it up. But just driving here this morning in the bus, I looked up in the news, and it seems like Russian journalists found the list of canceled Russian passports, and his is not on it. So apparently, he still has that Russian citizenship. You know, so it's incredibly right. It's incredibly contentious. So what the president also began to do, Ukrainian president, he has issued a number of decrees canceling at least a dozen, and now again maybe more, canceling Ukrainian citizenship of various hierarchs of UCMP who have been proven to have Russian citizenship. So potentially these people could be deported to Russia. That hasn't happened, but some of these priests who are collaborating were exchanged in the prisoner exchange. So Russia essentially has taken them. So again, that kind of serves the argument that they are valuable and are doing sort of Russian agenda in various ways, right? Several others have been sanctioned. And support in the society continues to decline. According to the latest poll, it's actually not even the latest, it's about half a year ago. Now only 4% of the population say that they consider themselves supporters or they affiliate with Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchy. And also substantial, I'm gonna come back to the previous two slides, but just to show as far as the polls, was only in Ukrainian, I didn't have time to translate, but what it shows is that 54% support banning this church. So this is, again, quite substantial, we can say. So the dark orange is complete ban. The light orange, that the state should actively control activities of this church, but do not ban it fully. And then the dark blue is that the state should not do anything, basically should not interfere. And the gray is hard to say. And again, there is some regional variation here. This is by region from west, center, south, and east. But in plurality or majority in each region supports the state doing something about this church and not just sort of doing nothing. So just to show you again kind of how contentious these issues have become, this is just from last week. There has been a case in Khmelnytsky, which is west of Ukraine. It's central western Ukraine. It's west of Kyiv, but not as far as western Ukraine, where a former soldier, veteran, came to the cathedral, which is Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchy, during service, and he stood up and said, "How many more soldiers have to die for you people to stop coming to this church?" Then there was a scuffle. Each side gave conflicting accounts. The Moscow Patriarchy Church says the soldier was aggressive, that he threw the Bible on the floor. The soldier denies it, but then he was beaten up in this church. So there was a video of this soldier being beaten up by a number of these priests of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchy. Then there was basically public outrage. So people showed up later in the evening to this cathedral. They voted to switch affiliation to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Now, of course, as you can imagine, the Moscow Patriarchy says that's completely illegal. This is what they called like raiderstva. Stan maybe can help me translate in English. What's the raiderstva? Like when you are illegal business. Corporate trading, exactly. So they call these, yes, raidership. So they call these, popular kind of gatherings to change affiliation as, an example of raidership. So that still is ongoing. The soldier is now in the hospital. The priest is in hiding. The bishop of this region, who agreed, who basically, to avoid confrontation, he handed over the keys to the cathedral. He has been dismissed from his position by the Moscow Patriarchy Church. So sort of again fits the narrative that they're really kind of anti-Ukrainian force. But of course, this is not how they and their parishioners see them. As I was saying, a lot of their parishioners serve in the Ukrainian armed forces, right? They collect goods and so forth. There are many lower level priests who have been in favor of much more explicit distancing from Russia. So there has been an open letter by about 500 Ukrainian priests of the lower level parish priests to their hierarchy, to basically saying you need to do these sorts of things to distance yourself from Russia. We can say that's maybe not that many priests. There has been allegations priests have been harassed and threatened and so forth. And there is also a lot of kind of bad blood between the churches. So on the one hand, the union seems easy because ecclesiastically there is no really difference. I mean, the service is the same, the canons are the same. It's not like switching to become a Catholic or Protestant. But, this narrative, which is very strong among the Moscow Patriarchy Church, that they're the only ones where you can receive salvation, that this other church is schismatic, that they are a sect of the Muslims, right? So this is really either Poroshenko pocket church, or it is, basically this Turk in Istanbul. So it is quite, really nasty in some ways, to charge this narrative. And furthermore, if they did actually fully break with Russian Orthodox Church, the big irony is that then they would become non-canonical, because you cannot have two canonical Orthodox churches in one country. Bartholomew, the ecumenical patriarch, gave the stomos to the OCU, so they are the legitimate, in religious terms, Orthodox Church is. So for all of these years, Moscow Patriarchy Church was saying, we are the canonical one, we are the legitimate one, you can only receive salvation if you are a member of our church, and all these other people are schismatics. If they were to break with Moscow Patriarchy fully, they in fact would become schismatic, because then the only way to stop being schismatic would be to join with the OCU, which is exactly which is exactly what they oppose. So to wrap it up, just to to highlight again the big problems that are out there. So the biggest question, of course, kind of hanging over all of this, is how to balance a protection of state security at wartime, we can say legitimate concern, and guarding against, propaganda narratives about artificiality of the Ukrainian state, sort of this Ukrainians are being one nation with Russia, the fratricidal war. They even say things such as like this, that Ukrainians are to blame, that they angered, that God sent this war on them. I mean, not everybody's saying that, but there is that kind of narrative in there. So we can say maybe that's a legitimate claim, or goal to do something about it for the state. But at the same time, of course, in a democratic society, there is this principle of freedom of religion, protecting the rights of individuals to exercise and worship in the way that they want. And these two are really in tension in Ukraine, and kind of how it will be solved, I think it remains to be seen. So the Moscow Patriarchate Church is not making it easy by, again, not explicitly breaking with rock in a way that they've been asked to do. So some of the priests issued these like 10 questions to our hierarchy saying you need to do these 10 things that they haven't done, and they sort of say it's not necessary, so they themselves are not helping their case in some sense. But again, as I was saying, I think if they did fully break, they would become schismatic. So they're really in a dilemma here, how to deal with this. Now, potentially, maybe a way could have been, but I think it's really too late for this now, given how high the tensions have become, that this law on renaming that essentially said that the church can function, but it has to indicate in its title that it is affiliated with Russia. So this law, of course, they objected to because it would have led kind of organically many people to leave, because oftentimes with this ambient faith in Ukraine, people don't even know. They kind of don't care which patriarchy the church belongs to. They just go to the local church. They may like the priest, or they may have been a church where their family went to, historically. And you see this, people are kind of like, they don't know. If it says Ukrainian Orthodox Church, like who asked whichever patriarchy it is. So if it said in the title, Ukrainian Orthodox Church in unity with the Russian Orthodox Church, right, it would have kind of organically probably led for more people leaving, but at the same time, the church could have continued to function with sort of hardcore of its supporters. But that law has been blocked by the court, and only in 2002 it got unblocked. And now, I mean, again, it sort of seems that's not where the state is going, that they now want to ban the church altogether. As I said, this wording that they're affiliated with center of influence in a country that is aggressor state. Now, if the church is banned, which I think is quite likely that this law would be passed, I don't think it's going to really solve the problem, because the people are not going to go anywhere, right? The priests are not going to go anywhere. We can have some sort of catacomb underground church where these sort of same beliefs that the state considers dangerous would continue. Now, admittedly, the procedure, it's not that they're going to get banned on the day this law is adopted. The procedure would be that the state would issue religious expertise and would tell the church what they need to change in their statute to break that link with the aggressor state. And then the church has a possibility to respond and correct that statute. If they do, then they can continue to function. If they don't, then it goes to court. And then the court would say like, okay, now since you haven't corrected it, so it's not kind of like we pass the law, next day everybody is illegal. But still, again, I think the fact that the people would remain, right, the beliefs would remain, the priests would remain, may also not be the solution. But at the same time, doing nothing is increasingly seen in the society is also not as acceptable. Or even just going after individual collaborators. So to say, okay, there is this principle of individual responsibility. This has been the narrative, some human rights advocates have advocated. So if you have a priest who's a collaborator, okay, arrest that priest, but don't sort of then generalize for the whole church. In principle, it seems reasonable, but the problem, of course, is that that's not how society sees it. And there are some good justifications, because the ideology of this church, this whole Russian world, this widespread, propaganda, I have some extra slides I can show later. I'm going to be ending here for now, that there is legitimate argument to be made that there is something not just wrong with individuals, members as individual citizens, but there are some issues with the institution that the state and the society is now very concerned of. So I'm going to end here, and I'll welcome your questions. And again, thank you for listening for this complicated. I hope I did justice to show the complexity, and I look forward to your questions and discussion.
Thank you. I think wait, is my microphone on? Green light goes on.
You want to use this?
Okay, yep, I'll use this. Okay, I'm going to make a list. I see Norman Naymark, I see Eric, and Norman, why don't you lead us off?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for a great presentation and overview of this of the church problems and issues. So the question in my mind has to do with the character of the crimes that are alleged to have been committed by these Orthodox priests, Moscow Patriarch. Can you talk a little bit more about that? In other words, is it, I don't want to say simply, but is it more of the nature, we are one people, we are one religion, the kind of general propagandistic stuff that's coming out from Moscow. And you can understand why the government doesn't like that, right? But are there really concrete crimes having to do with sedition, meaning organizing groups, with arms, undermining, military efforts, and that kind of thing? If you see what I mean. I mean, it's a little bit, I'm a little bit unclear whether they're just kind of mouthing this, crap that comes from Moscow, right, about one Russian world, or are they really doing things where they should be locked up and tried and put in the jail? And for the former, I'm not convinced. I mean, the state clearly will have an argument, but the latter obviously is something that's serious and needs action.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, this is obviously a very important question. Let me try if I can clarify it a little bit. So first of all, there has been amendments made to the Ukrainian criminal code after the invasion, which made these sorts of crimes that you're talking about. I'll read, like I had it in my notes, like public denial of armed aggression against Ukraine, right? Establishing approval of temporary occupation, justification, recognition as lawful, denial of armed aggression of Russian Federation against Ukraine, glorification of its participants, right? So these are the kinds of things that you're saying is sort of more like beliefs, ideology, right, as opposed to concrete crime, but it's now has been made a concrete crime in the, not just about the church, because it would apply for, a blogger or journalist, anybody else. And that has been a legal innovation, we can say, since the war started. So again, not all human rights agencies think that's the right thing to do, this whole question of proportionality, but these are now real criminal charges in the criminal code with real prison sentences, right? So, and some of the hierarchs are charged with this. So the picture that I had in the slide was this head of the monastery of the caves in Kiev, the Slavra, that's Pavlo, he's colloquially known as Pasha the Mercedes about his lavish lifestyle. But that aside, he has been charged because the SBU intercepted his phone conversation where he says about, oh, in Kherson, there are Russian flags, people are happy, right? Like that kind of thing. So again, you probably would say that this is not the kind of offense that you should be potentially jailing somebody. Well, exactly. So I'm not sure, right? But then there are also very concrete cases that they are not that numerous. And I think some of them are still investigated and some of them we don't even know because they remain on the occupied territories. But these priests who welcomed Russian forces, sometimes they would actually give the Russian forces information on Ukrainian activists in their village, right? They would sort of house the Russian forces, feed them and so forth. So there are these very like explicit, collaboration. And then the third, maybe like, I don't know if we would put it in a separate category, but some of the bishops, they outright split and sort of joined Russia, right? So they're, in other words, they're, what's the term? Like, it's not the bishopry, like the territory would be called, what would be called? Not the province, it's bigger, like it unites. So the bishop presides over the district, I guess, like it has some other religious term, that they outright succeeded and joined Moscow, right? And there has been no condemnation of this on the part of the leadership, which sort of again says like, okay, you're saying that these raiders, Ukrainian, are trying to take over your parishes, but the whole bishopates have been taken over and you don't say anything, right? So it is really complicated. So I think, again, I was looking through the UN Human Rights Report the other day, and they make exactly this kind of argument that proportionality, right, that this propaganda, yes, it's not great, but, maybe that's not the kind of crime. But I think in the environment of war, and given that it is so central for just kind of the whole rationale for the invasion, and that the criminal code has been changed, that these are now the types of crimes that people can go to jail for. And yeah, a lot of the participants are charged under those laws.
Eric Jensen.
So I Oxana, thank you for a fascinating presentation. You both clarified and complicated my understanding.
That's good, I guess. Yeah.
Of the church, but so I'm asking a lawyer's type question. I'm interested in your
Because
perspective.
he is a lawyer.
Your perspective on the role of the courts and the perspective of the courts. In 2019, they overturned this remaining law. Now there have been amendments to the Ukraine criminal code. What is your hunch as to how the Ukraine judiciary will react to these legal changes? And does that reaction differ across different parts
Yeah.
of Ukraine?
Thank you very much for this question, because this is something I've actually looked into, but I didn't have time to, talk about in the talk. I have read like dozens of these court cases over these disputes over the parishes. So let me talk about that first, and then I'll talk about this, the renaming law. So there, what we see, and it's really quite interesting, I think, would be for a lawyer, we often have different courts ruling differently on very similar cases. And that's exactly because of this collision. What has the primacy? The statute of the parish, which has been centralized and basically says parish has no rights, or the letter of the Ukrainian law on the freedom of religion that says the parish is the authority, right? And if your statute says otherwise, it goes against the Ukrainian law. And it seems like different courts kind of gave different weight to these two views, right? So we have these cases because sometimes it goes over multiple stages, like the appeal, the local court, the administrative court, the appellate court, so forth. And the different courts on the same case would rule differently. Some would say, okay, since the law says these meetings on the transfer have to be conducted according to the parish statute, and the parish statute says the priest gets to say who's a member, then you people can like switch illegally, right? But the other court would say, but the law explicitly says that the parishes have supreme authority to decide which affiliation that they can choose, right? And it's a statute that contradicts the law, therefore the transfer is legal, right? So there is really kind of variation there. So I think it goes to this claim that sometimes have been made. I mean, judiciary obviously has been very politicized, but I think it's more complicated story than the central government is able to kind of control the judiciary at all levels. Like that's not what I've seen in the, in this reading these cases. And also when I was doing field work there before COVID, I actually went to this village with contested church and talked to different local authorities. And what I found out, kind of to my surprise, that authorities at the different levels took different views. So in other words, it's not that Poroshenko was able to have like the whole government hierarchy follow his take when he was strong supporter of the OCU. In that particular case, the village head supported the Moscow priest. I was told because they have common business interests, who knows. But then the administrator at the rayon level, which is like a level above the village, he was in favor of the transfer. So she signed one packet of documents saying the parish stays with the Moscow affiliated church. And he signed the competing packet of documents saying the transfer was legal, right? So I think the role of the courts is complicated, right? And with this suspension, they didn't really cancel the law. So that court that suspended the applicability of this law was headed by this notorious Judge Vovka. I'm not going to go into who he was, but there has been sort of additional, he's been like known super corrupt and so forth. So there is this additional sort of level of complication. Did that court rule on the merit, or did it rule because the judge, that particular judge, was clearly very politically kind of prejudicial certain way, right? I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer to your question, but it's quite amazing really to see. I'm not a lawyer, but I read a lot of these cases and I can sort of see the argument being made for literally what looks like identical case. We have different rulings. So.
Okay, thanks. So on the list, I have Stan Marcus, and you should introduce yourself. He's our visitor this quarter. And then I'm and then I'm sorry, I don't know your name on the wall. Peter. Okay, so Stan, you're up first.
Sure. So Oksana, thank you. It's tremendous, very interesting. So it made me think about the trade-off between enhancing national security and restricting civil rights. And of course, it's a very general trade-off. We've seen that post 9/11 here. So if I understand your story correctly, that's the first question. Would you say that part of this trade-off in Ukraine is playing out to bottom-up decisions of people and realigning their identities rather than the Ukrainian state imposing certain constraints on their religious affiliation because of national security concerns. Like, is that a valid interpretation of, I think, the key argument that you're making? And the second question is about the state-church relations in Ukraine with the Kyiv patriarchy, not the Moscow one, but the two smaller Ukrainian ones, right? Like, I think would be very interesting to know what the state-church relations are. I mean, we have the empirical example of Russia, where of course there's a deep symbiosis between the Kremlin and the ROC. What is the picture like in Ukraine? On the theoretical side, you can think about Anna Shimala's book, right, Nations Under God. I think one of the arguments she made is that where historically national and religious identities were fused, basically churches have granted concealed access to policymaking. So how is that?
Yeah. Thank you. Both great questions. Let me try to do them
Can I
justice.
ask the
Yes.
Finger, because I was
Mhm.
going to ask the same thing within the context of Anna's book. See, I even wrote that down.
Yeah.
Can you frame this way like Anna?
Mhm.
Just so you know. I think we know. And also, are Armadas at all involved? With the decentralization that's gone on and this sort of idea of local self-government, does that in any way play into
Yes.
the decisions about what church a village or
Yeah.
group
Yeah.
of villages will join?
Yeah, thank you both for these questions. Let me see if I can do them justice. So Stan, to your question, is there sort of just the state doing things or bottom up? I think definitely there is a bottom up component to it, right? Because these changes in identity and sort of attitudes and strengthening, we can say, anti-Russian or pro-Ukrainian sentiment, I think makes this position of the government that Poroshenko government took and that Zelensky government, after some sort of period of unclarity, now seems to be following, right, after the Russian invasion, I think is definitely on a stronger social footing than it would have been before 2013, right? So I don't think sort of to Anna's book, like this national church, I don't think we are there yet. And moreover, there is actually minority support in society. I don't have that particular slide, but I was looking from the same Razumkov Center that does this very detailed every year opinions of kind of social attitudes to various things to do with religion. There is minority support for a state church in Ukraine. So there is no appetite among the society, even those who support, this church, for it to be in any way like a state church, right? And just yesterday, the Metropolitan, who's his name, Epifany, who's the head of this Ukrainian Orthodox, the independent one, made a statement. Again, you can take it with a grain of salt, but he's like, we are not state church. We don't want to be state church. We don't want the state, to direct us, so forth. So it's sort of two things are going on. On the one hand, there is greater support in the society for kind of Ukrainian church as opposed to Russian or so forth, but they don't want the state to kind of run it, right? Like the people don't want the state to run it. So I think if the state tried that, especially with this ambient phase, people who are just Orthodox, as Kathryn Warner puts it, this refusal to be coerced by institutions is very strong, for your average believer. I think it would be a tall order. So Ukraine may be moving. It's certainly closer in that direction, kind of what Anna is saying, right? But, and also if you add to it that there are Greek Catholics in Western Ukraine, which is essentially their national church, that church is not going anywhere. So even if somehow everybody consolidated around the OCU, which I don't think we see that, because again, in the East, like we don't see any of this attempted parish transfers, or really like single cases, right? So I don't think we would be looking at sort of national church in that sense, that like society and church are one. I don't think Ukraine is going to be that case, but it is certainly closer to that option or to that direction than it was before 2014. So that's what I would say. Did I answer?
The Armada.
The Hromada, right. So that's actually, again, it's really interesting. So this history of Hromada, which is like community, right? So this bottom-up self-governance has long history in Ukraine going back, to the Cossack period, if not before. And this is why I think the approach that the Moscow Patriarchy Church took with the centralization of its statute really cuts against both the tradition of this Hromada and the spirit of the Ukrainian law on freedom of religion, which basically says that the religious life is bottom up. So any 10 people can form a religious community, and then that community decides who they want to affiliate with, right? And like they own property and they have full right to switch, to sell, so forth. That's not the vision of the Russian Orthodox Church. It has been starting in Russia already in mid-90s. I've read some research about that centralization and kind of removing the power of the bishops. So now the way I think, so it's not quite sort of, because the Hromada is a secular institution, right? The church is religious, but this sort of centralization, I think, generally speaking, is against some sort of like political culture, right? Like in some sense, right? But now I think what a lot of these hromadas began to do, which is technically speaking illegal, but that again goes to show that there is, you know, this bottled tension in society. They have started passing local ordinances, basically saying, refusing to let the Moscow Patriarchy Church rent or use municipal property. So a lot of the, so there is sort of, so we haven't talked about it, but there is this question of property, obviously here. And these different parishes, the churches themselves, they are owned in various different ways. Sometimes it's like municipal, sometimes it's private, sometimes it's some cooperative. But now a lot of this hromada are basically passing legislation, local ordinances, saying we are not going to allow this church to rent or use municipal property. It just began happening, I wouldn't say like over the last months. The head of the Ukrainian State Service on Religion said in an interview recently that in his interpretation, that's not in the power of hromadas to do that. So it has to be regulated more at the central level. So again, so these measures may not have legal validity, but again, it shows kind of like we need to do something where sort of like the status quo is unacceptable, right? And sometimes if it's a private owner, that they would break the lease. That's actually exactly what happened with this monastery of the caves in Lavra, because under Yanukovych presidency, Moscow Patriarchy was given indefinite lease on this shrine of Orthodox faith. And then the state revoked that lease. They basically said that they have misused the premises. You can say it's political, sure enough, although there has certainly been mismanagement of the property. There are pictures of destruction. They broke some historical, you know, parts of the walls and built some stores and all of that stuff. But of course, it's happening now for political reasons. So yes, so again, that's maybe not a fully satisfactory answer, but
well, but it sounds like it's a situation very much in flux right
yeah.
now. Okay, Peter, and I will continue the list. Yep.
Thank you very much. My name is Peter Page. I'm from Jagiellonian University from Krakow, Poland, and for the short visit. And thank you very much for the seminar and great talk. I would like to ask you regarding one part of your lecture, identity. And because before the war, there were popular information, popular things that the eastern part of Ukraine is mostly pro-Russian. Right? So the information, newspaper, and public opinion as well. And I would like to ask you how war, the Russian aggression, changed this situation in the pro-Russian community, the pro-Russian part of Ukrainians. I can understand that there's a problem with the access to the opinion polls and the research, but can we now, to make any results from research done through this year, whether the situation has changed? So my question is regarding the identity of people who were pro-Russian before the war, and how this situation changed regarding the identity. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Let me actually, I have a couple of extra slides, maybe I'll show them quickly, but let me start by answering, this way. So when you're saying people who were pro-Russian before the war, do you mean in East Central Ukraine in general, or specifically in the parts of Eastern Ukraine that Russia has controlled since 2014?
I mean, if we can compare with the 2014 Donetsk and Lugansk, and later the parts were attacked last year.
Yes.
She had a slide.
Yeah.
You may have come in late. But
I did, like at the beginning, I talked about it, that there basically has been, even in these regions, there has been in the government controlled part, right, where the surveys have been carried out, there has been very substantial change in opinion on things such as attitudes to the EU, attitudes to NATO, speaking Ukrainian language, identifying with Ukraine, and even this thing, actually, since you are from Poland, I mean, this is not the kind of thing that Poles would welcome for understandable reasons, but this organization of the Ukrainian, it's called the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and the UPA, right? Attitudes to the UPA, which is like they have been obviously, implicated in participation in the Holocaust, in the violence against Polish civilians. And there hasn't, they have sort of support for giving them formal status as veterans and fighters for Ukrainian independence have been in a minority up until recently, where now there is a majority support for this, including in eastern and southern Ukraine. Now, that is not to say that this is really a symbolic thing. This is not to say that people became supporters of sort of these kinds of methods of interwar Ukrainian nationalism. And we can see, say, support for the far right in the parliamentary elections is, minuscule. But that has been a symbol of fight against Russian aggression and Soviet/occupation. I just want to see if I have these yes, actually this one. So just to show you that in the by region, right? So not only nationwide, the majority strongly or mainly support. So if you add these two together, it becomes like the darker blue. The definitely support and mainly support. So that's 50, 70, over 80%, right? Even in the south and the east, admittedly smaller, but also support. And again, this is a symbolic thing. This is not to say that people say, oh, that's great, that they killed, all these Polish civilians. It is their status as somebody who fought against Soviet state, which tried to destroy Ukrainian, idea of Ukrainian independence, so forth. Now, if we think about the territories where Ukrainian opinion polls are not being able to be carried out because they have, under occupation, there has been very few polling done there, but there have been two. ZOIS, this Berlin agency with Gwendolyn Sasse, have done telephone survey. Some sociologists question sort of how reliable these answers are, but the long short of it is that in 2000, from 16 to 19, even there was still majority support for kind of going back to Ukraine with a status of a region, maybe with greater autonomy. So there has been essentially some still presence of some kind of solution within Ukraine as opposed to becoming part of Russia. But then in a later wave that they did, I think it was still before the invasion, but it was after 2019, they found more discrepancy. In other words, the same East Central Ukraine, Donbass, the pro-Russian part, in the government-controlled parts, the attitudes kind of became more pro-Ukrainian, and in the non-government-controlled parts, they became more pro-Russian. So there has been sort of this growing apart, we can say. Again, people have raised questions, sociologists, about how valid these results are, given that, people are called in the occupied territory and asked, do you want to be part of Ukraine or Russia? But I mean, that's what they've been able to document. And I would further add that, Donbass, it has never been a monolithic. I was showing this map with the language spoken at the municipal level, right? And you can see, for example, northern Luhansk region, which was captured by Russia since 2022, right? Which was not part of this Luhansk People's Republic. It's primarily Ukrainian speaking, right? They were not able to conduct any of these successionist referendums and so forth, right? So these people are now under occupation. But, their attitudes are quite different from, probably people like around Donetsk and so forth, because again, it was sort of different demographics there historically for a while. It's more rural, it's more Ukrainian speaking, right? It's different. So, the shorter answer to your question is that yes, attitudes have changed and became more pro-Ukrainian in this historically kind of pro-Russian South and Eastern Ukraine. There is variation and maybe that increased over time between the parts that Russia occupied already in 2014, and elsewhere, right? And then again, like these things that NATO has majority support in the Southeast, right? That most people there would say like, yeah, the OUN and the UPA were fighters for Ukrainian independence. Like that has been unthinkable. I mean, Bandera would like not believe it in his wildest dreams. And it's really Putin's, like, I mean, these kinds of attitudes, like these are the results of the response to this aggression, of the Russian state. So, yeah.
Can you show again the 2019 election results?
Yes.
Because I think a lot of people don't.
Oh,
Yeah. So look at the difference. Right. So
yes. So this is support for pro-Russian as opposed to pro-Western parties, on the party list vote. So you see, right, this East-West divide kind of moving, right, in the. So yes, for sure, Zelensky was, not as we can say. This was not as perceived as anti-Russian as Poroshenko, but he certainly was pro-Western, and like there were many candidates, like the real pro-Russian candidates on that ballot, and they did not do so well. So this change in electoral geography, I think is very clear.
Previous Zelensky's party, if you can't see that.
Yeah, so he's like this movement over time. Yeah.
Karen. Sure. So Cara Stempleton, I'm a research fellow at the Institution. Totally out of my element. My question's going to reflect that. So given the Soviet legacy and the promotion of state-led atheism, why is the church such a prominent part of this story? And related to that, the schism or the different national churches in the two countries, is that a recent phenomenon that only goes back 30 years, or is that a Soviet era legacy or a pre-Soviet?
Yeah, this all requires a separate talk by a historian, but let me try. Like it is, yes, I guess 4 minutes. Okay, let me try that. So the schism goes back to 17th century, because this is when. So the Kiev got baptized. I mean, the Volodymyr accepts Christianity in 988, right? And and Kiev is basically under Constantinople as a metropole. Then, Russia creates the Muscovy at the time, creates a patriarchate. And then, and this is where historical narratives begin to diverge, many say that it was then managed to coerce the Patriarch of Constantinople to transfer the right to appoint the bishop in Kiev. And that's the decree, which I think, like, I don't know, 1500, 1700, long time ago, that basically put Kiev under the authority of Moscow, right? Which obviously originally Kiev was before Moscow, and there are all of these memes on the internet that there is a church in Kiev and there are bears walking around where Moscow used to be, right? Which is kind of true. But anyways, so this 17th century or maybe even earlier phenomena, right? That's the one that got canceled by the Ecumenical Patriarch in 2019 when he said that was illegal 3 centuries ago, right? So indeed it was like the patriarch was cursed, so forth. Now on the so the schism, so this attempts to establish independent Ukrainian church have been going on at least in the 20th century, kind of with attempts to establish sovereign Ukrainian statehood. So after the Bolshevik, after the collapse of the Tsarist regime, there was short-lived Ukrainian Republic. They tried to create this church. Sort of the question is, who would give them the authority to do it? Moscow obviously wouldn't. They sort of like self-selected these bishops. This is the origin of the autocephalous church. Nobody recognized them. So there was, and then of course that short-lived state was crushed by the Bolsheviks and, became Soviet Union. Now in Western Ukraine, it's a whole separate story because this Greek Catholic Church emerges during Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And originally, many Orthodox bishops didn't like it and the people didn't like it. But then sort of over centuries, it now became a national church for Galician Ukrainians. So the church was suppressed by the communists. So now we're going to the communist period, right? So when Soviet Union takes over Western Ukraine, that church is banned altogether. All the bishops are imprisoned and they convene a council where supposedly that church agrees to dissolve and join into Russian Orthodox Church, right? So they essentially functioned as a catacomb church during Soviet period. So the level of religiosity in Western Ukraine has been much higher because of the different, duration of time under communism. So this Greek Catholic Church functions as a catacomb church through the 1940s to 1980s. In 1980s, with Gorbachev's perestroika, they are essentially legalized. Then they begin to try to reclaim the parishes that the Russian Orthodox Church had. So that's sort of similar conflict. Then add to it, then the Russian Orthodox Church then splits into this, Kiev Patriarchy, Moscow Patriarchy. So I know it's a lot to fit.
I have no idea what he was asking.
Yeah. But to your question, yes. So this sort of, to say that there was this history of atheism and therefore, how come, like, no, it massively predates the Soviet era, right? And the legacy of the Soviet era is what we have, this sort of lower religiosity in Eastern Ukraine, right? So this pro-Moscow church, they really care about Western and Central Ukraine because this is actually people go to church. And that was the case in the Soviet period because the Russian Orthodox Church, I think at the time, I'm just now remembering the statistics, they had at least half of their parishes in Ukraine. Not in Russia, because again, there was much sort of more atheism and so forth. So they really resisted this formation of this independent Ukrainian church because it meant outright losing parishes and parishioners. So they lost some of them to the Greek Catholics who got legalized, and then some to the Kiev Patriarchy and autocephalous church that were not recognized, but separate from Moscow. So there is a lot of...
Yeah. So even under the height of Soviet suppression, Ukraine is a center of religiosity.
Yes. So in the, like, you know,
Relatively speaking.
relatively speaking, yes. But I mean, this is the thing, like if half of the parishes, right, of all of Russian Orthodox, that was the only legal Orthodox church in the Soviet period, are in Ukraine and mainly in Western Ukraine. I just kind of anecdotally, I mean, I grew up in an atheist family, so that's not my experience, but I knew Ukrainians who were communists and Komsomol members because we all had to be, right? And the teacher would warn them, okay, when you go to church on Sunday, go through the back door because I have to be at the front door taking note of who showed up to church, right? So, because then they had to report them and so forth. So, yeah.
All right, well, Oxana, thank you. Tour de force. I think people learned a lot. And as you can tell, classes are starting.
Yeah.
People are running out. But I hope you guys will join me in thanking Oxana.